Good evening. I am Jamie, and I am here talking about feminist literature or feminist icons. British literature at the turn of the century, New Woman literature, um, and suffragette and modernist, and how those things influence pop culture and what we see and what we hear through the decades, the century, because it's been a century and a half or so since then. So my original intention with this, what I realized I'm taking a visual rhetoric class, so I've been looking at the way things look. And I was I was reading Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow by Tom King and illustrated by Belquist Evely. And that's the basis for the new Supergirl film that's coming out. So I wanted to get an idea. I wanted spoilers, but the book itself is like 5 years old. So I don't know if it's really a spoiler at 5 years old. It's kind of like if you tell someone, Lincoln went to see Our American Cousin at Ford Theater. Okay, no spoilers. No spoilers. I don't want to know. It's been 61 years, but no spoilers. I don't want to know what happens. So I read this book and it blew my mind, but there was a scene. The scene that introduces Supergirl has Supergirl in an outfit that reminded me of some of the New Woman comic strips that we looked at in class, specifically the ones with like bicycle suits. Because of the pants and the jackets, it's just this was in color because they would have been in black and white back then. It would have been before William Randolph Hearst was like, just give the color printed to the comics. That's fine. And he changed the way we looked at comic strips and actually invented Sunday comics at that point. But that's a whole other story. So the way Supergirl was dressed in this bar on this primitive planet with a red sun, because with a red sun, she's able to get drunk. So she's dressed incognito, and this guy ends up hitting this young girl. So Supergirl stops him in a Supergirl way. And she does it without powers because there's a red sun. So she's not as strong as she would be under a yellow sun, for all the nerds out there. And the guy, as she incapacitates him, rips her like jacket or shirt that she's wearing, and you see the S shield, the famous S shield. And that's what got me thinking, that one panel of her in like the bicycle suit with the S shield exposed, that these feminist icons are still Tom King wrote this book, and those comic strips were drawn by men trying to be funny about the New Woman and I guess their fear of the masculinity of them. But in that, it's almost as if these women would read that and gravitate towards it. So it's almost like this weird counterproductive thing where the men, what they fear, they're almost willing into existence because of their ignorance of their part in what they're playing. So my thing was like let me see here, because I had all these crazy ideas, like the male influence on feminism. Feminism doesn't really work unless women are involved. These things just kind of came together in my mind, and I was using Supergirl at first to kind of pinpoint and narrow down some ideas because of the art style that was used in that book, but also when she came around, and even later on in the book, she's dressed in her Supergirl uniform. So she has the S, which is the House of L, which is her dad and her uncle and her cousin's name, not hers because she's female. It's the patriarchal system there, and she wears that, but she's also wearing a skirt, and it's kind of this like mixed message. And when she came out, I thought of this the other day. It's sort of like the confusion of the atomic age, because she came out in the late 50s, and Superman found out he had a cousin who was younger than him, and he's like, all right, we got to keep this under wraps. You're going to go live in an orphanage, and you're just going to be a sidekick. So she wasn't even relegated to like a star player. And I didn't realize until watching the documentary Reign of the Superwomen, and I believe it was Trina Robbins, the artist and writer and comics historian, who had pointed out that after World War II, the women that were working in the factories, making the tanks, the planes, the bombs, everything, that the men who left, who were drafted or volunteered to go to World War II, they left to do that. So the women were doing it. After the war was over, the men came back and they got their jobs back. So the women went back home to domesticity. So even though they introduced Supergirl, I think to appease female readership, they still relegated her to the background. Like, 3 years later, Marvel publishes the first book under the Marvel Comics banner on August 8th, 1961. It was the Fantastic Four. So you have Mr. Fantastic, the Thing, the Human Torch, and you have the Invisible Woman, who she has more powers now, and she's more of a force to be reckoned with now. But at the time, I think the name says it all, unfortunately, because she could become invisible and disappear into the background. And it's kind of sad when you look at it. So I answered a question. The question was, how might studying the modernists and suffragettes complicate how we define political literature? And I kind of went into this thing, and I might just read it because it might help contextualize. Because instead of Supergirl, I know that was a long intro, I'm going to focus on the most popular non-real feminist icon, and that would be Wonder Woman. Because Wonder Woman was created in 1941 by two men who were born in the 1800s, and they would have grown up and matured and been around when women were fighting for the right to vote and just rights in general. So, and also William Moulton Marston, the writer who created Wonder Woman, his wife is from the Isle of Man. So she would have grown up around the suffragettes, the modernists, the new women, fighting for that as well. And plus she was educated. So she would have been probably the shining example of a new woman, as would have Olive Byrne, his live-in mistress, who famously wore those bracelets that Wonder Woman had. I don't know if they defied bullets like hers, but I wrote this. Since modernists were disillusioned after the First World War, they played more with streams of consciousness and straying from conventional reality. The suffragettes were firmly placed in reality. The reality of not having any legal rights, the reality of having to be militant to be seen and heard, the reality of being seen as less than men who ran everything. If Virginia Woolf is considered one of the modernists, then her room of one's own to be able to write fiction would seem to not be about most suffragettes. Women who had enough pounds, obviously the monetary pounds, to have a room of their own were not in need of any voice in Parliament. They led comfortable lives, at least on the surface, and thus the fiction they would write would most likely mirror the lives the suffragettes lived on a daily basis. So, as far as political literature goes, they might find themselves on opposite sides. If Downton Abbey is an example, the Lord and Lady of the Manor and their daughters benefited from the system that disenfranchised the women in their employ. The contrast is stark, and the downstairs stayed loyal to the upstairs because of the hierarchy of the society and the need for employment. It is interesting that in the US, white women got the right to vote 8 years before their counterparts in England, and England ended slavery at least 32 years before the US, even though the wheels of justice started turning for it decades before. As I don't know if anyone's ever seen the film Belle. It's a pretty decent historical film that talks about like the major case that led to England eventually ruling against slavery. It took a long time after that, but it had to start somewhere. In a way, it makes me think of 2016 to 2024, and I go into women running for office and all these things, but what it really makes me think of is the definition of this word that I found: androcentrism, the practice of placing male perspectives, experiences, and behaviors at the center of cultural, social, and historical norms, treating them as the neutral standard for humanity. This perspective marginalizes women in feminized traits, treating them as deviations from the male norm. It is prevalent in language, healthcare, and academic research. And we see that a lot. Like with the New Woman literature, you had like Daisy Miller written by a man. You had other things written by men and women, obviously writing as well. But it seems like if they were writing an answer to what the men wrote and how they saw a new woman, like Daisy Miller was from the U.S., so it would obviously she would be different than a European new woman. So in our time in history and all written history, it seems to be from that androcentric perspective. They say history is written by the winners. So once I read that word, all these ideas about like the male gaze affecting feminism and thus feminist writers and the artists drawing about feminism, or even after that, like I always mention Nell Brinkley because her art, she was a famous female artist in the early 20th century who drew beautifully and made a name for herself on her own. So she was a pioneer, really. I think that's why I just keep bringing her up. And I only found out about her last year, and I'm ashamed. So I have to preach the gospel of Nell Brinkley as much as I can. Bilquis Evely's art reminds me of the way Nell Brinkley adds detail, the detail and the lushness of the characters, and the way a woman draws a woman is different than a man, and it's hard to explain unless you've seen. There's some men that can really draw a woman, don't get me wrong, but it's sort of like if you've ever seen Project Runway, female designers design differently than male designers, or I should say straight male designers design differently than female and gay male designers, because gay men and straight or gay women designers appreciate a woman's body for different reasons than a straight man does. So they are able to accentuate different areas and get a different feel for what makes a woman than a straight man would. Sorry, there's just a little hot take there, but it's true. I've watched every season of Project Runway and I've seen it. So I just really wanted to talk about Wonder Woman and William Moulton Marston, how he created her, why he created her, and I wrote about it in my artist statement. So I might just read a little bit of that as well. So my original intention with this was to prove something that unfortunately is already painfully obvious, that feminism is directly influenced by the androcentrism of society. That is akin to boldly proclaiming that racism is the outcome of Anglo-Saxon colonialism and the spread of Christianity. Well, duh. What I wasn't ready for was learning historical context for the creation of pop culture icons. And two, perhaps three are important and even still relevant to this day. That would be Wonder Woman, Supergirl, and Invisible Woman. There were others before and in between, but those are three that are still in the public consciousness now as we know it. Trina Robbins was the first female artist to tackle Wonder Woman. She and Gloria Steinem grew up reading the William Moulton Marston originals from the Golden Age of comics, specifically 1941 to 1947, which was the year Marston died. According to Robbins in the documentary Reign of the Superwomen, the creation of Wonder Woman by Marston specifically aimed at girls. She goes on to quote Marston from an article in the American Scholar from the winter 1943 to 1944 issue. Not even girls want to be girls so long as our feminine archetype lacks force, strength, and power. And I want to go into that because in this essay from the American Scholar, Marston says, Superman and his innumerable followers satisfy the universal human longing to be stronger than all opposing obstacles and the equally universal desire to see good overcome evil, to see wrongs righted, underdogs nip the pants of their oppressors, and withal to experience vicariously the supreme gratification of the deus ex machina who accomplishes these monthly miracles of right triumphing over not so mighty might. Here we find the Homeric tradition rampant, the Achilles with or without a vulnerable heel, the Hector who defends his hometown from foreign invaders, wronged Agamemnon who pursues his righteous vengeance with relentless fury, and the wily Ulysses who cleverly accomplishes the downfall of attractive, if culpable, enemies by the exercise of superhuman wisdom. Homer did very well for himself with the troubadour technique in an age when pictures had to be painted by imagination. Here, more of the Superman Wonder Woman picture stories build up this inner compulsion by stimulating the child's natural longing to battle and overcome obstacles, particularly evil ones, the better chance your child has for self-advancement in the world. Certainly, there can be no argument about the advisability of strengthening the fundamental human desire, too often buried beneath stultifying diversments and disguises, to see good overcome evil. Happy endings are shown in the new comics as products of superhuman efforts to help others, not as mere happenstances, mysteriously obeying the Pollyanna rule that everything always comes out all right in the end. The moral force of this new type of story teaching is stronger far than the older appeal to self-interest. Be good and you'll be happy is a difficult idea to sell. Children don't believe it, even in stories. Nor are they greatly impressed by its converse. If you're bad, you'll get punished. They qualify the latter precept by adding, if you are caught. And when a religious teacher resorts to the next world for a flavor of inevitability, the averagely bright child in this cynical age remarks, but how do you know what happens in the next world? Heaven and hell are a long way off psychologically from a child's today, but heroics are their daily bread. The most radical departure from previously accepted rules of picture story content resulted from an early recommendation of mine to the publishers. To me, it seemed from a psychological angle that the comic's worst offense was their blood-curdling masculinity. A male hero at best lacks the qualities of maternal love and tenderness, which are as essential to a normal child as the breath of life. Suppose your child's ideal becomes a Superman who uses his extraordinary power to help the weak. The most important ingredient in the human happiness recipe still is missing: love. It's smart to be strong, it's big to be generous, but it's sissifying, according to exclusively masculine rules, to be tender, loving, affectionate, and alluring. Oh, that's girl stuff, snorts out our young comics reader. Who wants to be a girl? And that's the point. Not even girls want to be girls so long as our feminine archetype lacks force, strength, and power. Not wanting to be girls, they don't want to be tender, submissive, peace loving, as good women are. Now, this is 1943. I just have to caution everyone. Women's strong qualities have become despised because of their weak ones. The obvious remedy is to create a feminine character with all the strength of a Superman, plus all the allure of a good and beautiful woman. This is what I recommended to comic publishers. And I believe they laughed at him at first. But then Wonder Woman premiered, she became incredibly popular, and they made a lot of money. So they realized he was right. So Wonder Woman, after she came out, and we have to think about her this way. She came out in 1941. Her costume is incredibly patriotic. It has a gold eagle on it. It's red, white, and blue. It has the stars. So, she's designed specifically. When she came out, we were on the cusp of entering World War II. So we weren't in it, but Europe was. And she, obviously, the existential dread was there. So she was created, and then I think within a month or two of her coming out, we entered the war. So there's this need for patriotic heroes. She and Captain America came out around the same time. Superman had been out for 3.5 years. Batman had been out for 2.5 years. And other heroes had premiered within that time as well. It's the same time frame, I believe. Archie, the All-American Teenager, came out. So there was this need for some femininity in with all this masculinity. Even though Archie did have Betty and Veronica, who are icons in and of themselves. So Wonder Woman became this huge, massive hit. And as I said earlier, women were then doing the jobs of men once the men were being shipped overseas. So women were actually, in reality, filling those more masculine roles. And William Moulton Marston, in 1928, he was teaching at Harvard. And he was with his wife, or Harvard's, the female school at the time, that was Harvard's female school. So the main school was still male, and they had a women's school. And his wife, they were teaching, I believe, psychology, because he's a psychologist. So is she. His ideas helped develop the lie detector test. And unfortunately, we can't give him a lie detector test because he's been dead for almost 80 years to find out if that's true or not. But he grew up at a time, and he had an independent, smart wife. So he grew up at a time when he would have been interacting with new women, suffragettes, and modernists. He would have seen their struggle and been with them. So he was a huge feminist. And even though he lived kind of like a dubious lifestyle, having the mistress live in the house, and he fathered children with her and his wife, and they lived together happily, like the wife and the mistress. I mean, like they understood the relationships, and it's that's a whole other story. But it just psychologically why this man would have created Wonder Woman based on his wife and his mistress to be a role model for other women. And years later, after he died, other male writers took over. She isn't written with the same fervor for women's rights. And by the late 60s, they take away her powers, and they have her as like a knockoff James Bond. And Gloria Steinem is upset by this because when she was a kid, she would read Wonder Woman comics. Her and Trina Robbins would both read Wonder Woman comics as kids. The original Charles Moulton was his the name he wrote them under, but William Moulton Marston would write them, and he would have Wonder Woman. She would never kill her enemies. She would try to rehabilitate them. She would, through love and understanding, even though she was stronger than them, she was, better than them at everything, she would still try to help them reform. Superman doesn't kill, as we know. Batman doesn't kill. Like these characters have a code, and I know anyone out there who's seen Man of Steel would argue that point because of what they have Kal-El do to Zod in Man of Steel, but the argument can be nullified by pointing out that it's Man of Steel. He's technically not Superman yet. And as Kal-El and Clark Kent, killing Zod would be that moment that turns him into Superman, the man who doesn't kill. Like he would need that loss again, because as a baby he wouldn't have felt the loss of Krypton. So that argument is moot, because that is actually a valid argument for that. So Gloria Steinem wrote an introduction. Miss Magazine published a collection of the original stories because she lobbied DC Comics and other people, and she didn't like the way that Wonder Woman was being handled in the comics as a female James Bond that had I Ching was her, I think, karate instructor. Like, it was going away from the Themyscira Amazon part of her history. And so she lobbied DC, got them to redo it, and they published a collection of some of the early stories, and she wrote an introduction. And in this introduction, it's a long essay about Wonder Woman. She says, mythology is a collective human memory that has, on other occasions, turned out to be accurate about invasions, great floods, and the collision of stars. The Amazon cultures may also one day be proven as fact. Meanwhile, the fascination that brings them up as fantasy again and again may itself be some psychic evidence of their existence. If so, Wonder Woman becomes just one small, isolated outcropping of a larger human memory, and the girl children who love her are responding to one small echo of dreams and capabilities in their own forgotten past. And she goes on to say that in 1973, this was published in January of 72, so she probably wrote it in 71. In 1973, Wonder Woman comics will be born again because they would have been written ahead of time. I hope with the feminism and strength of the original Wonder Woman, my Wonder Woman, restored. But regardless of her future, the original adventures of the golden 40s will remain classics for children, boys as well as girls, and perhaps for many heroine-starved and nostalgic grown-ups as well. If we had all read more about Wonder Woman and less about Dick and Jane, the new wave of the feminist revolution might have happened less painfully and sooner. And she also says at one point that empathy is really the most revolutionary emotion. And that is what Wonder Woman showed to her enemies, to her friends, to the world, was empathy. And it wasn't what happened. I was doing my research for this, and I was rewatching Wonder Woman from 2017. And there's a scene where Wonder Woman is in England now, and Etta Candy, who is Steve Trevor's secretary, is helping her find clothing. And then the film, instead of happening during World War II, they have it happen during World War I. And I never really thought about why they would have done that, other than to distance themselves from Captain America, the First Avenger, another patriotic hero, and about World War II. So I was rewatching it the other day, and there was a small exchange where Diana is trying on a dress, and she says, how can a woman possibly fight in this? And Etta says this line that is probably a throwaway line to anyone else who is not taking Brit Lit this semester. Etta says, fight? We use our principles. I mean, that's how we're going to get the vote. And, the line is only a few seconds long. The scene is only like a minute or so longer when they finally find, something that fits her personality, I should say. But that line stuck with me because I realized, I was like, oh my goodness, it's 1917 or 1918. They're fighting this war against Germany. And, Diana's looking for Ares, the god of war, who she knows is behind this war. But that's just the backstory. But this line tells me so much about Edda and all the other women in the background of this story that you don't see, that they're still fighting. They're suffragettes. They're modernists. They're new women, or the new wave of new women. And Wonder Woman comes along as this ultimate new woman, like the newest of the new women, because she's strong, she's smart, she's sexy. Not that it matters, but in a world ruled by men, the male gaze is going to, if it was Medusa, everyone would get stoned. So you're not going to have her in there. So it contextualized it then, because it makes more sense to put her there, because that's William Moulton Marston got married to his wife in 1915 when his wife couldn't vote. In the U.S., it still would have been 5 years till she could vote. And over in England, it would have been 13 years till she could vote. So, they're putting Wonder Woman in the middle of a time when Marston would have seen his wife and other women like her fighting for the things that Edda is fighting for in the background of this film. Whereas Wonder Woman is fighting a literal war and literal battles, because she, at one point, for those who haven't seen it, she goes through no man's land. It's no man's land because no man can get through it, but a woman, a Wonder Woman, a superwoman, is able to get through. A new woman is able to get through where no man is able to get through. And I think that's a very powerful message. And we have, I'm trying to think, because Trina Robbins wrote about Wonder Woman also. She's also, I believe I also mentioned, the first female artist to work on Wonder Woman. And as far as I'm aware, that might have been in the 80s. And that is horrifying. So she gives us a brief history that in December 1941, a psychologist named William Moulton Marston created Wonder Woman. That was her first appearance, was dated December 1941, so it would have come out a few months before. He knew exactly how to go about creating a super heroine for girls. And we had already read some of his quotes, because she quotes that article. And writing his scripts in longhand, Marston combined his knowledge of psychology with elements from mythology and fairy tales to create the mythical Paradise Island, Themyscira, the homeland of the Amazons, where men are forbidden to tread. Princess Diana's origin springs directly from classical mythology. The mythic hero is usually born from the union of a virgin and a god, and when the virginal Amazon queen, Hippolyta, desires a child, the goddess Aphrodite instructs her to mold one out of clay, then breathes life into the statue. Thus, Wonder Woman's divine parent is, in this case, a female deity, and little Diana has two mommies. With Steve Trevor, an intelligence officer from the United States, when he crashes his plane on Paradise Island, he's rescued and nursed back to health by Princess Diana. She saves his life, falls in love with him, and eventually takes him back to America. Disguised as an army nurse and later as Lieutenant Diana Prince, she stays in the man's world to fight injustice as Wonder Woman. With her, she brings some accoutrements of science fiction and fantasy, a magic golden lasso, which compels anyone caught in its links to obey the lasso's holder. Like, to tell the truth, it's commonly known as the lasso of truth. An invisible plane, which Wonder Woman can contact telepathically, and a mental radio, which resembles a small TV set in the shape of a Greek temple. But she goes on to say that the most powerful humanistic message in Wonder Woman, and the one most constantly repeated, is that superpowers are not necessarily for a girl to become a superheroine. The Amazon princess herself does not really possess superpowers. Her incredible strength, speed, and agility are the results of superior Amazon training, and with comparable training, any woman or girl could become a Wonder Woman. And she goes on to say how male um, male writers, artists, and historians, comic book historians who are also artists, like Jim Steranko and Les Daniels, who was a comic historian as a writer, they go on to kind of misunderstand Wonder Woman because they see Wonder Woman from that androcentrist perspective of of being men. And I guess my whole reasoning was that these female icons would still be androcentric because you see Wonder Woman with a skirt, you see Supergirl with a skirt, you see Supergirl wearing the S and the cape that her cousin wears. You see Wonder Woman because men look at Wonder Woman as like a bondage fantasy instead of like her wearing armor, her wearing a skirt because she's feminine, but still being able to do super heroic, like masculine things. And I think we need to readjust our view of not only feminism and we being men, because I'm a man, and I started out, like I said, with a whole different idea, and I came away with it like realizing that Gloria Steinem reclaimed the Wonder Woman and tried to beat back those androcentric ideas that separated the Wonder Woman of 1971 from the Wonder Woman of 1941. In those 30 years, because of who was guiding her, she lost her way because women weren't guiding her. And I didn't realize that. So my train of thought, my line of thinking wasn't guided by the same kind of principles. So reading Steinem's article, I realized that women can look at women that other men create. And so even though I'm thinking, because the original Princess Diana was created out of clay, so that also ties into that New Woman story about that artist who made the statue and his wife, and her dying, and the statue comes to life and all that. Like I do believe that Marston really cared. I guess in a way he's almost a New Woman writer, but in a post New Woman world. And I guess that would actually be the thesis. Wonder Woman represents the New Woman, the suffragette, because of Alan Heinberg writing in his screenplay for the film from 2017 about World War I, and that throwaway line about getting the right to vote. So you have all of these male writers who try to understand their allies for the cause, for the New Woman, the suffragette, and the modernist. And we need to study superheroes, the genre of comics that is superheroes can be studied for its historical relevancy and how it can clue us into not only the time period in which they were published, but also the time in which the writers and the artists grew up and how they were affected. Like we can surmise just from Wonder Woman many things about Harold G. Peter, the artist, and William Moulton Marston, the writer. and why they would gravitate towards this story or the storyline or what it represents and who it influences and why it influences them and why it was important to them. We can appreciate that more knowing the history of the character and the history of the writer and the artist and the time period. That's the point. And I realized I tried not to let it get away, but I think there's a lot about that one character. And if you look at Gloria Steinem, Ms. Magazine, or their publication of those Wonder Woman reprints from '72, because I believe it's Wonder Woman, a Miss Magazine publication, if I'm not mistaken, even though I might be, but it's an index to Wonder Woman is what it is. A Ms. book, that's what it is. So you have that, and you have Trina Robbins, who is a famous female writer and historian who's able to look at things through through the lens that we all should, and help us see that empathy. She helps us empathize. Gloria Steinem helps us empathize with the cause. So I don't know if they do say, they being, I'll just say society, because more than one person has said it, that Gloria Steinem helped make Wonder Woman an icon, a feminist icon, even though she was an icon before that. And that was by taking her back to those roots. And if you look at that essay, was published in 1972. 1974, there was a TV movie of Wonder Woman starring Kathy Lee Crosby as a blonde I Ching period Wonder Woman. And that's the period I spoke of where I Ching was the guy who taught her karate and things. Like she wasn't the classic one, which is why I believe a year later in 75, when Linda Carter, the most famous version of Wonder Woman, came out, it was called the new original Wonder Woman, because they were, I believe, finally listening to Gloria Steinem and the fan base. Like, yeah, this is the Wonder Woman we need. Because even the first season of that show took place during World War II, and the pilot episode did a pretty good job of adapting like the first few appearances of Wonder Woman, like her origin, and that led into the first story from Sensation Comics #1. Her first appearance was All Star Comics #8. If you read those stories and you watch the pilot episode, it's almost a direct adaptation, and it's probably one of the most comic accurate adaptations of all time to this day, 51 years later. So I might wrap it up there. My love of Linda Carter's Wonder Woman all these years later. So I thank you for listening and for listening to me ramble. Once again, I am Jamie, and I hope you all have a great day.